Welcome to Fairy Tale Access, where the head fairy's quest is to prove that fairy tales do exist in actual time rather than once upon a time. Together, we will unravel the heroes, young and old, who turn dreams into reality. These are the people who still believe in happily ever after. The discoveries will bend even our most cynical non-believers into believing in fairy tales. Welcome to Fairy Tale Access. Today, I'm excited to introduce you to author J.C. Kang with Songs of Insurrection. Now, if you love dragons, you love spies, arranged weddings, murders, a little bit of magic, and a touch of romance, this is definitely the series to look at. Thank you for joining us. How are you today?
I'm doing great, and thanks for having me. Thanks for your kind words about the book.
Oh, my pleasure. It was so much fun. I mean, there's princesses, almost arranged marriages, spies, intrigue. How did you come up with the story?
Just like my everyday life.
Oh, okay.
No, I'm just kidding. It's the third book I ever wrote, and actually, I'm sorry, it's the fourth book I ever wrote, and it's part of the Dragon Song saga. And I'm going to hold up. This one has sold about 50,000 copies on ebook. So people, if they've seen me before, they probably know it for this. So it's a 4-book series, and this was actually the last one I wrote. And what it was that I had queried it to agents, and I had gotten feedback that the original book, what became book 2, the first few chapters were too long, and so they suggested putting it into a new book. And so I wrote a new book based around that story, and I sort of had to just pull it out of nowhere.
Wow. So that's crazy because this book has so much going on and it still leaves room for growth. So
hopefully lots of growth because the main character, I had to de-age her 2 years. And so basically there's a starting event and a final event that was in the original book 1 that had to become an entire novel. Originally it was just like 2 chapters, and it became an entire novel in between.
Wow. Well, it was truly amazing. So give me a little background. Where does it take place?
So when I was a teenager, like many teenage nerdy boys, I played Dungeons and Dragons, and I created a world, which in retrospect, when I saw it again 25 years later, I'm like, oh my God, my 14-year-old self had no concept of gravity, economics, anything. And so I decided I was going to recreate this world. And when I did, I was at the end, I was like, what am I going to do? Because I don't have time to play Dungeons and Dragons. So I'll write a book. And so it takes place in my remade Dungeons and Dragons world, which I call Devara. And Kaya, the main character, her story takes place in a country known as Cathay. Well, similar to the old name for China. And there's a reason for that.
Right. It's in Imperial China. So yeah. So what was real and what wasn't real? Because there are some great elements. Like, are night blossoms real?
So the concept of a night blossom, I mean, basically, I will point out to Alice Poon. She is a Canadian Chinese author, and she wrote a book called Ming Courtesans. And she has done a lot of research into courtesan culture in China. And so there are many nicknames for prostitutes, basically, and Night Blossom is one of them. But I point to Alice Poon. If you look her up, she wrote an article about how courtesan culture has evolved over the years.
Wow. What about the ghost-tripping thresholds?
This is real. If you ever visit the Forbidden City in Beijing, you'll have to step over these big thresholds and hopefully not trip like a ghost. But if you've ever watched any of the old Chinese movies, you'll see that they have like these hopping zombies. Mm-hmm. And what it is that Chinese corpses Chinese bodies are tied, the big toes are tied together so that they can't walk if they're animated. And so they have to hop. And so the ghost tripping threshold is to be too high for them to hop over.
That is so cool.
So is it real? I mean, it's real Chinese superstition, but I have yet to see a hopping zombie.
Okay. Well, so what about the ghost echo? Is that a real thing?
The ghost echo is basically ventriloquism. So
Oh,
kind of real.
that's exciting. I loved all the elements of it. It was so wonderfully well done. And it just really like kept you hooked into the story and trying to find out what was real, what wasn't.
Yeah, there are two arcs to the story. Basically there is Princess Kaya and her drive to learn dragon songs, a lost magic, and then there's the spy thriller part of it. And these are two separate arcs where I was kind of arrogant at the time, and I was like, you know what? I think I can get the people who like fantasy romance, and I think I can get the people who like epic fantasy to love this book. And so I tried to do two things, and it actually that didn't work as well as I'd hoped it had, but it definitely does have two different arcs to it that eventually come together at the end.
I know, but I loved it. I love the way that it all came together. Now, what about elves and dwarves? Is that actually part of the Chinese culture? Do they have folklore with elves and dwarves in it?
Not really. Chinese will believe in spirit creatures, in like bamboo forests and stuff, like spirit of a forest. But basically, this is a melange of both Eastern and Western fantasies. I grew up on the Chronicles of Narnia, which has dwarves, and Lord of the Rings, which has elves and dwarves. And so when I started to write my own world, I wanted to fuse these things together. So there are aspects of both Western and Eastern cultures in there.
What about the dragon singers? Is that a real element of the Chinese culture?
Well, I find that when I listen to Taylor Swift music, I get very moved. And so I don't know if it's Chinese culture, but is it just magic? And I mean, music in general. I think music has an almost magical ability for some people. Now, whether Taylor Swift could really make me do something with her music, I don't know.
Wow. All right. And then it's gotten really good reviews, all of them. So that's good.
Well, the reviews are mixed. There are some epic fantasy fans who don't like the romance aspect of it, and there are some people who like the kind of the romance women's adventures part who don't like the ninja thriller part. And so I do get some of that. And then I got some younger Asians. They felt there are a lot of too many stereotypes and things inside of it. So it doesn't get universally great reviews, but I'd say overall, the overall series, the big book, has almost 800 Amazon reviews, and they're all, averaging 4.5 or so. So I can't be too bad.
No, it's great. Well, and I think the romance is really light, or does it get better?
It changes.
It
I think you have
changes.
to look at book two, and as a spoiler, I think what I wanted to set out was to create a kind of a love at first sight, insta love, which a lot of people don't like nowadays, romance, and then turn it on its head later. So I think book two, you kind of have a very different feel about what's going on.
So, what type of places have you been to that helped influence the story?
Well, I lived in Taiwan for 3 years after college, and also I lived in Japan for a year after college. And I have visited China, been all over China. So a lot of these places, and watching a lot of the media while I lived here, there created a lot of influences in terms of storylines and themes.
Was there any one place you drew upon more than another to write different scenes where things take place? Like at
For for Thorn of, I'm not sorry, not Thorn of the Night Blossom. For Songs of Insurrection, it would probably be the Forbidden City in Beijing. That's kind of the idea, the layout I sort of took from that. Though coloration wise, it was related to the Chiang Kai shek Memorial in Taipei. And then my wife is from Kyoto, Japan, and I visited Kyoto many times. There are many just gorgeous temples there. And there is a section called Gion, which is kind of famous for, like, well, anyway, there's parties and stuff going on there. So that was sort of my influence for the floating world.
what about the suspicious vibe for Hardeep? Who influenced or what influenced that?
How much do you want to know? I mean, do you want to be spoiled?
Well, no spoilers, but just what you drew on to write that type of character, because that was extremely well done.
Thank you. I'm glad someone thinks so. Basically, in the earlier iterations of the story, he was just totally supportive, and he was like too good to be true. And then my critique partners were like, he's too good to be true. And so I started to create suspicion in him that maybe he's in it for something else, that maybe he's trying to use her for something and to try to, so I tried to create doubts so that a reader would have doubts as well.
I had a lot of doubts about him. I wasn't sure which.
Well, I hope you read book 2.
I can't wait.
Can I show off the cover of book 2 here?
Absolutely.
This is the cover for book 2.
Treacheries.
Orchestra of Treacheries. Yeah.
That sounds good. So what about book 2? Were there any places that influenced that series, part of the series, more than another?
So book 2 takes place both in the main city that everything's been happening in, which is Huajing. Huajing literally means the capital of Hua. The original version of the story is not the one you had, but the first edition, I used a lot of Chinese names, but then I swapped them out. Like I started to use Cathay instead of the original name, which was Hua, just because a lot of English speakers had a hard time following it. So most of it does occur in Hua, but there is a part where Kaya goes to negotiate, negotiate with a foreign country. So there's a foreign country that is based on East India.
Ooh. Have you been to East India?
Have I been to India? No, I have not been to India. I've watched several Bollywood shows, and I just love Bollywood, the singing and the.
I know, I love it too. It kind of flowed like that. It really had a nice flow to it. It was like watching a movie from Korea or Taiwan. You know how they just like, it's like everything just like, I don't know, it's so smooth. It was really.
Well, thank you. I'm glad someone says so.
What about, is it Tian? Tian?
Tian.
Tian.
Tian literally means heaven. I mean, every Chinese people have a Chinese character to the name, and his name means heaven. He is me, kind of, in terms of, I oftentimes have these ridiculous, crazy thoughts going on in my head. And sometimes I have the solution for every problem in the world, but I can never articulate them. I get really nervous under pressure and I start to ramble on, like, as you can tell. So he's kind of me in that regard, that I'm definitely not as smart as he is, but he's the sort of person who's a very visual thinker and cannot articulate things into words. And so that was sort of my idea with him.
Well, I liked him. He was a little socially awkward, but he had a nice character. What about G? Is it G? Jie?
Jia, you would pronounce it Jia. Mm-hmm. And so here's the thing. These were placeholder names when I first started writing. And I think, for example, actually Kaya's original name was Jingjing, and she was named after these two Beijing Olympic divers, or Chinese Olympic divers, Guo Jingjing and Tian Liang. And they had this really torrid romance. So those were the original names. Jia is a homonym for older sister in Chinese. The character literally means skilled or cunning, kind of like she is. But it's a homonym for older sister, which is Jia.
What about Kai Long?
Kai Long.
Kai Long.
Kai Long. What about him?
Well, I guess he believed he was the best suited to run the country. How does his character develop in the next part of the series?
So for the next part of the series, he's kind of behind the scenes basically plotting along. This is, I guess, is kind of a spoiler for book 1, because in book 1, he's just like, oh, I'm going to help Kaya do everything. He's sort of like that encouraging person the whole time, but he's basically trying to set her up the whole time. And in book 2, a reader knows that he is not a good person. And so book 2 is more about showing his goals and his plans. And so book 2 is very more Game of Thrones-ish, where you have plots upon plots upon plots, all mixing in with each other.
What about the moon in the series? Because that played a big role, the iridescent moon.
So there are 3 moons. There is a moon kind of like our, Earth's moon, which goes around the planet 30 days. Then there is the iridescent moon, which stays in one spot. So we would call it a geosynchronous orbit. And so one of the cool things about it, just talking to some astrophysics people, friends, my smart friends. They were saying that, yeah, it would go through all its phases in a single day. And I was like, people would tell time. I mean, my first idea was they could use it to, gauge direction. But I was like, oh, they could use it to tell time because it's in one single spot in the sky all the time. It's also a huge hint for the bigger idea of what else is going on in the world.
Oh, wow. That's cool. What other elements did you tie into it that you can share without spoiling the story?
What other elements? So I had mentioned we have Eastern dragons, well, an Eastern dragon and a Western dragon. I don't think we've met the Eastern dragon or seen them yet. Definitely Western folklore type characters like elves, dwarves. A lot of Japanese feudalism. So I'm a huge fan of Japanese samurai dramas from Japan, and so I used a lot of that to influence like kind of how some of the noble culture worked. Also, I played Civilization, which is Sid Meier's Civilization, is a video game from like 1992-ish or so, and it has this idea that you could have like the Chinese near the Americans and develop like that. And so one of the things I always considered was what would happen if you had a China, like a imaginary China that was close to an imaginary Eastern Europe. How would they influence each other? And so a lot of that comes into the story as well.
No. Well, how do dragons fit into the Asian culture?
So usually dragons are symbols of good. So they're messengers of heaven. They control the rain, control the oceans. So they're generally considered to be good creatures. I think with Western, I mean, most of the early stories, the dragons are always evil, though I think later on you'll see like good dragons as well. But for the most part, by and large, in Asia, dragons are benevolent and auspicious creatures.
Oh, that's funny. Because in Europe, they're really not.
Yeah, they're well. My uncle was he was a professor of anthropology, and he wrote a book in search of dragons, and he posits that dragons, you see them in cultures across the world, and so they are a mix of primate predators, raptors, snakes, and predatory cats, and so they're kind of a melange of that, and so you see that in almost every culture.
You do. Isn't that weird? And that they have a completely different view of them.
Yeah, actually, my uncle's book is called Instinct for Dragon, I believe. So,
Oh, wow.
and so his idea was that we have a primordial instinct to believe in dragons.
Is he the one that you dedicated the book to?
Yes, he also wrote another book called Warrior Woman, and he basically went over biographies of a lot of famous warrior women. He was an Aikido sixth degree black belt in Aikido, and he had just passed away when I published that book.
Oh, I'm sorry.
David Jones,
David
very
Jones.
common name. Yes, but David Jones, Woman Warrior, Instinct for Dragons. He wrote some interesting books, which I have on my shelf. Well, not here, but downstairs.
They sound great. What kind of books did you read growing up? I mean, you've shared a few, but what other influences are in your background to create this kind of story?
So when I was younger, I was primarily a fantasy reader. And so, like, my brother read The Chronicles of Narnia to me, and then The Hobbit. Then I read The Lord of the Rings for my own. I think I must have been like 8 or 9 years old at the time. I was like addicted to Middle Earth. So I read this. I don't quite understand what happened to the Silmarillion. I need to reread that. But anyway, a lot of the Tolkien stuff. The Eternal Champion, Elric, the series, Stormbringer. I can't remember the name of the book series anymore. The Dragonlance Chronicles was a huge influence for me, by Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman. When I was as a Dungeons and Dragons player, when Dragons of Autumn Twilight came out, we were all excited. Here's a D&D novel, so we all ran out and got it. And then I remember standing in line when the bookstores were about to open to go get these books. So in bookstores that are no longer in existence. So Dragonlance was another huge one.
Wow. What's it like playing the game Dungeons and Dragons with this kind of storyline? How does that play out?
It's been I'm showing my age here, 40, maybe 30 some years since I've played Dungeons and Dragons, so I really couldn't tell you. What I do know is it's become really popular. There's the Critical Role. There's that it's basically live casting a Dungeons and Dragons game.
Mhm.
I get the impression that a lot of people enjoy it, but I actually haven't played since I was 18, so a long time ago.
Wow. What about things like why was it important for Kayla? Is it Kayla or Kaya?
Kaya,
Kaya.
Kaya. Hmm.
Why was it important for her to have such a strong moral compass?
Well, part of her story is that she's very much influenced by these legendary tales of dragon singers. And so the story she read has imbued this sense of morality in her. And then her father, basically, the entire idea of Chinese rulership, it's Confucian in nature. It's like the ruler must be a moral person. He must know this, 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 and this. And so she always has this idea of how morality should be, and sort of that's always her guiding principle. So she usually makes the moral decision, even if it brings harm to herself, which in book 2 it does. Oh gosh, yeah. And book 3 it really does.
Really?
Book 3 actually is my favorite cover. I'm gonna just show that one off too, right there. So
Dances out. Oh, that is a great cover.
yes, my artist is incredible. He's just not necessarily reliable with deadlines.
How did you find him?
I believe I found him on DeviantArt. I just saw like his works. I'm always looking at fantasy artwork, looking for talented artists, and so he's probably the 4th artist I've commissioned in my books. I mean, all of them are very talented, but he's the one I've been going with for the last 12 books.
Wow. How many books have you written altogether?
12. 12. I say this because I've recovered several books. So no, I guess I have 14 books. No, 12. 12 full
Hmm.
book. Well, 6 novels, 6 novellas. And so all the novellas got new covers. The original novels got 3 different covers. So I've used different artists at every stage.
What are the other books about?
So if you like the floating world and the idea of the floating world and the night blossoms, I have a series called Scions of the Night Blossoms. It is about it's a Jia when she was younger, and also Tian when he was younger, when he first joined the Black Lotus clan. And so it takes place mostly inside the floating world. It is not. It's more dark. I think basically Songs of Insurrection and the Dragon Song Saga is more of a heroic fantasy versus Scions of the Black Lotus is probably a little darker. It touches on darker themes like prostitution. um, so
What else? What are the other ones
it,
about?
and then the other one after that, Masters of Deception, is the start of a new series, which I haven't actually done much with besides book 1, and then Crown of the Sundered Empire, which is also a book 1. Masters of Deception is basically includes Jia. So the thing is, when I wrote the story, Jia was supposed to be a sidekick character, but all my readers just loved her so much, so she became the glue to hold all my stories together. And so she's one of the main characters of Masters of Deception, along with 3 others who make appearances throughout the Dragon Song Saga, just as cameos. And it's basically about 4 people with separate agendas who have to come together to solve a problem. And then Crown of the Sundered Empire is a military fantasy, which is basically princes and princesses who have to do certain things in order to fight off enemies. And it also includes a young fisherman who has his eye gouged out, and it's replaced by a glass eye that's possessed by a demon. Excuse me, possessed by a demon, just like I was right there. Excuse me.
So, a glass eye possessed by a demon. And
Yes. So it lets him, like, if you remember RoboCop, do you remember RoboCop where
yeah.
he already had targeting and stuff? So he has a slingshot, and when he uses this slingshot, it creates a crosshair for him, and then basically he can see in the dark, and he can see heat and cold when it wants him to. So yeah.
Wow. So it must be a struggle. Is he a bad character or a good character to begin with?
He's gray. I mean, he's basically like, I think he's 16 years old, and he just wants to be appreciated. He has a misshapen face, mismatched eyes, and so he claims to be a diviner, basically being able to see the future, but he's basically just really smart, and so he can draw things together and make predictions based upon what he sees. And then when he loses his eye, because people think he's evil, he loses his eye, and then he gets a demon eye, and so yeah, he has to use that to save his village from invaders.
Wow. That sounds really good. So do his
I had a
eyes
lot of.
match when he has to replace it?
I'm sorry. Oh
Well,
no, his eyes no longer match. He originally has a blue and a green eye, but then later he ends up with a brown eye. So I think a blue and a brown eye. It's been a while since I've actually. It's been a while.
how do you keep track of all the characters?
I don't. No, I actually just write. I know all the main characters and most of the details about them, and I definitely have it all written down somewhere when I need to go back and cross reference.
Oh, that's fantastic. I don't know
I
how
should
you
have
keep.
brought should have
Yeah,
brought all my book covers.
yeah. I don't
So
know how you keep them all together, like organized, because they all have such distinct personalities and traits. They're really well developed, and the world building is exceptional.
thank you. I should actually mention I do have another novel under the pen name Jace Kang. I mean, basically, it's a non-secret pen name, and it's actually a mashup of cyberpunk and cultivation fantasy, which is basically progression. You're going out like martial arts progression, and there are actually connections to that and the Dragon Song Saga as well. So, I think I'm kind of like Tien, where he sorts information on a board and draws strings between them. That's kind of how I am.
Oh, that's fun. Wow. Well, thank you for sharing so much about how you developed this story. It's action packed, it's 500 pages, and I couldn't put it down. So it kept me up really late a couple nights. I really appreciate the excitement, especially
Thanks.
during this end of COVID.
I don't write about plagues, but yeah, it was interesting. It was definitely COVID was an interesting time.
Yes.
So,
But this was something that just, gave you a great escape.
thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure. Until next time, keep asking questions. And if you want a great series, J.C. Kang is definitely the author to seek out. And Songs of Insurrection, you're going to love it.